cell phones. Tonight we welcome back to the Harvard COOP Dawn Brockett. We at the Harvard COOP first had the privilege of meeting Dawn when she was published in 2021 alongside many women's powerful stories in What Doesn't Kill Her, Women's Stories of Resilience. And I was at that event, and I tell you, there was not a dry eye in the house. It was a very emotional night. And now we are beyond pleased to be able to host the launch of her new book. Dawn is a classically trained chef, college professor, advisor to clinical trials in anorexia, and the managing director of a medical society. She is a master yoga instructor and has an honors degree in philosophy, a graduate certificate in French language and literature, an advanced graduate certificate in French literature and poetry, a graduate certificate in negotiation and peace studies, and a Master of Public Policy and Administration degree. When do you sleep? She also serves on the Idaho Shakespeare Festival Board of Directors. In Unrestricted, How I Stepped Off the Tightrope, Learned to Say No, and Silenced Anorexia, Dawn challenges the pervasive belief that anorexia is compelled by a desire to control. Given the limited progress medicine has made in treating anorexia, the deadliest of all mental health disorders, she issues a call to action to change the way anorexia is viewed and treated through the lens of her own successful battle against the disease. Please join me in welcoming Dawn Brockett.
Thank you so much, Ashley Weaver and the entire Harvard COOP crew. You make everything so special, and I really appreciate that. Thank you. Today is the launch day of Unrestricted, and as such, it feels right to thank a few people who made this entirely possible. I should probably thank them every single time, but definitely today. So again, to Ashley and the COOP crew, it's very exciting to be here. To my publisher, Harridan and Strumpet, the managing directors of that, Carrie and Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking a chance on me and for bringing it all across the line and making it entirely possible. My editors along the way, Jana, Elizabeth, and Dulcie, it wouldn't have been nearly as good without you. The photographer of the cover photo, my friend and the father I needed, David Kennerly. The scribe of the prologue, recommendation for writers, make sure you have someone better than you write the prologue and better than you write the epilogue, so the first and the last thing that anyone reads is phenomenal, and I am in that fortunate position with a prologue by Dr. Katerina Malievskaya and an epilogue by my best friend of 100,000 years, Emily Tazy Parker. But more than anyone, my love, my rock, the only reason any of this was possible, Lisa Marie Wood. Thank you, Lisa. A few thoughts before I read from the book. I want to talk for a moment about why I started to write this book. And to be fair, I didn't actually start to write a book. I started to write to understand, because I find writing is very valuable in terms of just, I don't know, clarifying any sort of muddy thought process going on in my brain. So I started to write what ultimately became this book to best understand how I brought myself to the point that I did on the brink of death with anorexia nervosa. I wanted to make sure I never did that again. As it started to turn into more, and Lisa sent me on a writing retreat where I met Dulcie, and they seemed to think I had a book, my first fear was that the book was ultimately unrelatable, because it's a small fraction of people that deal with anorexia, and it's not exclusively, but primarily young women. So I felt like generally the topic of the book wouldn't relate to many others. But what I learned along the way is that I was wrong. And I love learning that I'm wrong, particularly this time. And I learned that while anorexia is an extreme version of restriction, many people can relate to feeling constrained in their life in some unhealthy and damaging way. So I found that the subject matter is relatable. So if you don't have someone in your life that battles this, but you're curious, I hope that it's still very worth the read. Why the subject itself matters. See, this happened to me last time. This thing moves, and you would think I would remember that from last time, but no. Anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. It has held this terrible standing since the rates were measured, since the inception of the DSM in 1952 when anorexia was listed as the only eating disorder, and of course we know now there are many others. The mortality rates since then have increased, so it holds the standing still as the deadliest mental illness. There are no pharmacological agents that improve in any way, shape, or form, so there's been no pharmaceutical positive studies. And meanwhile, not only does mortality tend to increase over time, eating disorder rates as a whole are increasing over time, and dramatically during the pandemic. We saw about a 70% increase in eating disorders during the pandemic, which is terrifying. The one form of therapy that has shown benefit, particularly in anorexia, but across the spectrum with eating disorders, is family-based therapy. It's rarely used. The third phase, I find this fascinating, the one thing that is shown to help, the third and final phase of family therapy is establishing healthy independence. And anyone who reads my book will find that I believe that to be a critical piece of recovery from anorexia, certainly was for myself. And I speak a lot to what gets in the way of that as potentially a cause. According to Dr. Tom Insel, who is a best-selling author of the book Healing, also the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health between the years of 2002 and 2015, he shares that there are no standards of treatment for eating disorders or OCD or borderline personality disorder or PTSD. No agency is responsible for the quality of psychological or psychosocial care that is given, which is kind of hard to believe when you think of how much we tend to other medical disorders. And you are very hard-pressed to find accountability measures anywhere within eating disorders, but certainly when you look into treatment centers. All of that said, there is a huge and growing need. And at the same time, I truly appreciate the work being done by those who are doing the work. It's phenomenal. It is difficult and painful and arduous work, and often you're helping those who seem to not even want to help themselves. It's a very difficult place to be in. But there's so much more to do. And my argument in this book, my underlying thesis is that we need to change those foundational beliefs about anorexia. We need to revisit the axiom. You heard Ashley introduce me with my educational background. My undergraduate's in philosophy. And I remember studying that if you start somewhere and from there you try to walk yourself to a logical conclusion and you don't get to where you're wanting to go, you need to revisit your axiom at a certain point. And I think we're there with anorexia. The current axiom, the current party line, I've heard it called, is that anorexia is about control. That is false, it is insulting, and it has gotten us nowhere. One of the generous statements about my book on the back comes from Dr. Murali Doraiswamy, who is a professor of psychiatry and medicine at Duke and the former co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Mental Health. I don't know when he sleeps, but he says that the book is a powerful call to action for the field to modernize the perception and treatment of anorexia, which impacts more than 80 million women worldwide and carries the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. And it is that piece about modernizing the perception and treatment that I'm very, very interested in. The support the book has received, as you've already heard, is phenomenal. I am honored by it. I'm frankly surprised by it. I thought I would come up against a bit more conflict, but I haven't. I know I will. But the receipt so far has been absolutely fabulous. Without further ado, we'll jump right into the book. So with my background as a chef, and with anorexia having something, though certainly not exclusively, to do with food, each title of each chapter is partly psychologically related and partly culinary related. I also start each chapter with a quote. I'm a collector of quotes. I love them so much. They're so inspirational. So each chapter starts with a quote that inspired me somewhere along the way in writing the book. So beginning with chapter 1. The breaking of so great a thing should make a greater crack. William Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra. Chapter 1, Salt and Control. On the corner of Sun Valley Road and Main Street sits a bustling bistro. Columns of river rock support exposed brick walls. A bar runs the length of the room, heralding a commitment to regional beer and wine. Bartenders at the ready with a sample or a recommend and a backstory. The best seats in the house are benches built into a wall of windows, offering a somewhat occluded view of Mount Baldy, the grand dame of the row of peaks that comprise the Sun Valley Ski Resort. Its size and presence providing perennial comfort to the valley below in the way that only tall mountains can. Covered with a thin cushion, the benches form a U of right angles. Bohemian-flavored throw pillows allow one to burrow in for a protracted and cozy dinner, each additional course securing the prized real estate for another fraction of an hour. Here, I have shared meals with my family, my spouse, my dearest friends. New and lasting friendships have emerged out of conversations with neighboring tables in this three-sided, window-fronted getaway. It is a protected and secluded space, one where, more often than not, I dine alone, a practice that provides an opportunity to savor and settle, moseying my way through the uniquely sensual experience of a well-orchestrated and executed meal. In these moments, I am nowhere but here, absorbed by the desire to take it all in, to breathe and smell, taste and touch, see and feel the plated art that the chef has deliberately created. I am wide open, all in. It is a lovely exchange of appreciation, which is to say, presence. Sometimes a flash of inspiration prompts me to write a few words in the notebook that I always carry in my handbag. Other times, my bench neighbors will be social, and I will oblige. Most often, I hold these moments for myself, for the sole purpose of filling my tired, scattered, deadline-driven mind with such an overload of sensory input that all else fades. It is a reliably edifying and balancing ritual. And this is where I grab a drink of water. So I'm not clearing my throat the entire time I'm reading, because I will. On one such evening, as spring succumbed to summer, when the once vividly white snow at the very top of the governing peak mixed with dirt from May rains, I returned to this dining ritual to peel myself up from feeling stampeded, to become again three-dimensional, to nourish my fading sense of self. With an abundance of irons in the proverbial fire, I needed to withdraw from a few overextending decisions, to recover some guarded space in which to move about freely, and to protect a few pockets of time not bookended by urgency and others' needs. I had become absorbed by the everyday. I had become indistinguishable from my usefulness. A single goblet of an Italian farmhouse red blend lasted all 4 courses. House-made burrata with a wedge of homemade bread, wild yeast leavening Italian wheat, all smothered in the grassiest of olive oils. Mama's salad with globe grapes, kiki arugula, and salty earth pecorino, roasted Brussels with grilled Marcona almonds, sweetened lightly with saba, and the coup de grace, affogato, a homemade vanilla bean gelato drenched tableside with hot, strong, freshly brewed espresso, a timeless marriage of complementary opposites. At the moment of the first kiss, espresso to gelato, a thermodynamic timer begins. All will soon melt and blend into a lukewarm coffee cream soup. The divine experience of this dessert lies in the instant of friendliness just beyond the stark distinction, the first melding, the curiosity of one substance for another. The dessert derives its name from the Italian word for drowned. My senses still delighted, my mind unburdened, I stepped outside into the cool, early summer evening. Strolling the 3 blocks back to my hotel, the vanilla bean and espresso flavors lingered on the sides of my tongue. Gentle conversations with the neighboring table echoed in my eardrums. Without warning, swooped up from life and dropped unceremoniously onto the battlefield of the mind, I found myself trapped in a psychological flash flood, pressed against invisible walls rising swiftly and jaggedly from the sidewalk, like vertical cliffs, impossible to climb, a random attack. Memories of simple pleasures experienced only a moment ago were ripped away. The emotional rapids rushed me. There would be no escape. Sobs lashed out of me uncontrollably, submerged by this drowning wave, choking their source with gasps of desperation, until a wail crept out of my laterally stretched face, a melodrama of sorrow, escaping narrowly as a wounded wild animal from the steel jaws of a hateful trap. The sheer force pummeled shudders through my contracted form, and I spun into a free fall toward the depths of misery, of self-hatred, of self-destruction. I lumbered down the stairs from the sidewalk to my room, leaning all of myself into the door, its weight suddenly incomprehensible. Inside, I collapsed into a sinewy heap on the hotel bed. The monster was back, my annihilation, his goal. So alarming were the sounds coming from my shrinking self that soon a knock came at the door. The hotel manager arrived. He was a thoughtful young man who routinely double-checked my reservation to make certain that my room was conveniently located for my furball of a dog, Coco. Traveling this time without my beloved puppy, I still booked the ground floor, sharing a thin, old wall of this ski-bum hotel with the room reserved for the overnight staff. He had, no doubt, heard every terrible sound. I cracked open the weighted door, present enough to feel a tinge of embarrassment, but without the faculty to shift my current heavy reality. "Somebody died," I croaked. "I am so sorry," he said, with a warm, sad eyes and a sincerely concerned tone that sounded almost relieved. He had no idea what to do next. There was nothing to do. I closed the door and slid, without pause, down its back until my bones hit the floor. In a way, my lie was terrifyingly accurate. Someone was dying. Me. Again. And I thought I wanted to this time. God damn it. In these consuming moments, preferring solitude to rejection, I shove away everyone and everything that I love, or at least I try to. Some have seen this act of sudden rejection before and have given it the credibility it deserves, which is to say, none. The monster's cruel coup of my mind is recognizable in the behaviors that it compels. It can be a thankless, heavy task to love an anorectic. A mighty storm simmers just beneath the glimmering surface. We swim in dangerous waters. The threat of drowning is nearly always imminent. Rescuers, beware. Sabotage lives here. I know that this subject matter holds not only the possibility, but the likelihood of moments that emit a sort of pungent acidity. The imagery is gruesome, at worst, disconcerting, at least. After all, it is a story of starvation, nearly to death. I would love for this to be an old story that no longer affects me today, but it is not. I still dance with this devil. The moves are intricate and over time somewhat predictable. It is this predictability, that's where I am. It is this predictability that I hope to illuminate and decode. The present reality of a desperate time is rarely well understood until a person has lived it, passed through it, and is on the other side, looking back, beyond the imminent threat of returning to that place, simply by connecting with it through physical and mental memory. The story I share here is now at a safe enough distance for me to turn back to face it, yet still close enough for my perspective to be accurate to the experience. It is recent history. Though memory is a tricky thing, it is fraught with danger and the soft sadness of old hurt soothed by behaviors that encourage amnesia. The cause of the hurt may be long forgotten, still the pain remains. The wonderings of hazy and faded recollections and the absolute uncertainty of truth contrast ironically with the burdensome weight of that sharp ache. What terrible thought does memory keep at bay? What door does it guard? What movement does the heft of it prevent? What connections have been lost to it? Countless. I know this for certain. Creating and maintaining space is the answer. Space and a clear distinction between what is me and what is not, between what I crave and what I must do to name and satisfy the need, that has learned to mask itself with propriety and deprivation. Let's get this out of the way. Anorexia is not about control. I feel like I should say it again. I won't. Anorexia is like trying to bake a tall, round, crusty, pocketed loaf of bread when you have been given frigidity and salt to feed the yeast instead of sweetness and warmth. The anorectic, working with the wrong ingredients before she is savvy enough to know the difference, arrives at the table with a hard, dense, inedible brick, and then is beaten to a psychological pulp for this failure by the very voices and thoughts that tricked her into believing that she had enough to share, all that she needed. Yet, she does not have enough even for herself. Taken in too great a quantity, salt is poisonous. Our evolutionary biology causes us to recoil at oversalted foods. It is an overwhelming sensation. The natural response is rejection, and the immediate addition of fluid, a drink of water, a spitting and summoning of more saliva. But it is not the salt that is inherently wrong. It is the relative quantity of salt to the volume of the other ingredients, the ratio of salt to liquid volume, of control to space. Imagine for this analogy that salt is one's natural ability to exercise control over one's own life, and volume is one's space in the world, room to move about in a self-defined manner. Anorexia is about shrinking to accommodate the space that you have been allowed to take up in your life, the exact amount of space that you can hold without making anyone else uncomfortable. Healing from anorexia is an act of insubordination, of self-defense. I must expand into the space that I have been denied, the space that someone else thinks belongs to him. Be assured he will fight back, accustomed as he is to taking up all the space that he desires, unquestioned and unchallenged. Let's play more with this analogy between salt and control, volume and space. Imagine a stovetop, gas-fired, cleaned and ready for dinner preparation. On one burner sits a large Dutch oven-sized pot, perhaps enameled cast iron, for proper heat distribution. Let's pretend that it is red. On the adjacent burner sits another large pot, also high quality and conductive. This one orange. Dinner plans this evening involve the making of 2 soups. It is deep fall, nearly winter, the season of wool socks and crackling kindling. Homemade broth simmers in a giant pot on the back burner, a medium for the combination and distribution of flavors for both soups. It is unsalted, allowing the chef full privilege in the proper layering of herbs, spices, and salts. Into the red pot, with a drizzle of oil, I toss the holy trinity of Cajun cooking: onions, celery, bell peppers. In hours, the red pot will deliver its goods, a spicy, smoky, okra and filet thickened gumbo. For those keeping track, the okra is being properly smothered in a separate small pan. Into the orange pot, I throw fistfuls of mirepoix to sweat and oil over low heat, the base of an herb-forward, wintergreen spiked white bean soup. I soaked flageolet beans overnight, drained, fattened, and softened them in the simmering water this morning. I salted them to taste. They are now cooling in a side bowl, awaiting their addition to the soup. The 2 pottages, markedly different, both rely on judicious applications of specific ingredients at particular times in predictable quantities. The ratio of salt to liquid is critical. Showering the Holy Trinity and the mirepoix with salt from on high initiates a process that will encourage the surrender of water from the vegetables into the pan to be heated and released as steam, both cooking the base and providing the opportunity for caramelization, the prolonged meeting of heat and sugar. In addition to accelerating caramelization, salt enhances flavors. It is best as a supporting actor, highlighting the leads, shedding light on their palate-pleasing performance, a balance of freedom and self-control. Now I add the smothered okra, bay leaves, thyme, smoked paprika, and cayenne, black and white pepper, pinches of my own proprietary Cajun spice blend, and garlic to the red pot. Another heavy layer of salt, and many ladles full of simmering stock. The smoky paprika and gamey white pepper spice the air with an exotic aroma as the soup develops with the thoughtful layering over time of salt and broth, of self-directed control and space. Into the orange pot, I add freshly chopped rosemary, thyme, tarragon, a drizzle of olive oil, roasted garlic cloves, white beans, and another heavy shower of salt, anticipating the addition of quarts of stock for balance. But no. In that moment, the tyrannical executive chef enters, impatient in his booming voice, the voice of restrictive anorexia. He needs the orange pot immediately, the pot in which the soup is at a delicate, imbalanced stage needing space or stock in which to develop. Empty the contents now, he glowers. The only available pot is the small pan in which the okra smothered, still coated with thickening slime. Hurriedly, pre-thought, I dump the developing white bean soup into the crowded pan. I run the demanded orange pot to the dishwasher. I pour one desperate ladle of stock over the bean soup, all that will fit, return it to low heat, covering it to prevent the release of what little liquid there is, keeping the whole mess from scorching. He cranks the fire back up. The pressure increases in the small, packed, flavor-imbalanced container. Don't you know how to make soup, he says, taunting me. He tastes the bean soup, then offers his critique. This is disgusting. He used way too much salt. The soup is worthless. I've not added too much salt. The well-seasoned gumbo has the same amount. But this salty soup has been confined to too small of a space. I know that given enough space to hold the base and the medium in which the flavors would marry and disperse, the soup would be delicious. With a reasonable amount of time and room in which to develop, freedom in which to expand, the flavor of the soup would be appreciated, the salt a balanced component of the variety of ingredients swimming leisurely and plenty of broth, the simple privilege of many a soup. The anorectic is the white bean pottage and arrested development, crowded by the needs of others and the voice of anorexia in her head. She is not oversalted or controlling. Rather, she is underspaced, cornered by others' demands of her. The voice feels masculine. Throughout this book, I refer to a disembodied he, representing both the voice of anorexia and the destructive social narrative undergirding the widespread belief of male superiority. I believe that the voice of anorexia and the narrative of masculine superiority and thus feminine subjugation are closely related. It is widely accepted that anorectics are perfectionist, risk-averse, and controlling. On the first two, I surrender. Yes, layers and complexity are collapsed into convenient labeling, but all sides of the argument end in nearly the same location, the subtlety is not worth dissecting here. However, with the control claim, I take singular and serious issue. It is a label of false identity, a tool to minimize, a corrupting blame misplaced. The anorectic as control freak accusation is a straw man argument, false, evasive of the real problem, easy to destroy. So if a person's goal is to simply destroy her, to define the identity of the shrinking person, to shape her agency in the way that will best reflect onto him, to excise her hope of finding the will to take up a column of self-sustaining space in the world, he should carry on with this self-serving attack on essential humanity. Label her controlling, walk away, feel superior. She will shrink further, and he can puff himself up into the space that she surrenders, feeling deserving about his bloated sense of self-worth, further buoyed by the twisted kindness of the illness. Her guilt for having inconvenienced him by simply existing will drive her to exist less, ever smaller. Space is critical for the integration of one's own identity separate from others. Overriding this natural universal need for individuation forces the body to create the necessary space by shrinking or fighting or both. This I have learned. To defeat the demon, you must hold your ground and appear large. You must discover and use your voice. You must fully inhabit your space. You must stop depriving yourself to feed him. He will try to make you look crazier than you already feel. Someone is going to get hurt. Someone has taken squatter's rights on your sanity. The moment that you know for certain that this space is yours and that you are willing to defend it, you can know that you are going to win. No doubt you will lose many battles in this war, but in the end, you will win by inhabiting the place in this world that rightfully belongs to you. The potential that fills you, that seeps out through your generosity, it is yours to direct, to fulfill, and at times to abandon in pursuit of the path of a changed mind. This living is an act of creativity, not of control. Refuse him the right to write his failed life story on your bones. Your story is your own to craft. Thank you so much for listening. That was chapter 1. And from there, the book goes into childhood through, I don't know, late 20s-ish, kind of tracking the journey of anorexia into and out of. So thank you so much for listening. I'm thrilled, all of you tuning in virtually, all of you here in the room, truly among my nearest and dearest. Thank you. Happy to take any questions at this point.
Could you give a little more background on like the pot analogy? Where did the inspiration come from?
Yeah, I know. I was timid to read that section because it really requires this creative engagement, but I still think it was the right one to read. But it requires a little effort for sure on the listener. So thanks for asking that question. When the book was just a concept, and I was sitting in a hot springs, and lava hot springs with Lisa Marie, and we were talking about my conviction that anorexia is not about control, but it's about space. She asked me to give a bit of an explanation of kind of what I meant. So we're sitting in a hot springs with distilled, particulates of different kinds, right? And depending upon, how much of any certain mineral is in the water, it has certain properties and what have you. So I think that was the inspiration behind the salt to liquid. And of course, my history as a chef, which obviously inspired some of that story as well. Yeah. Tom?
What is the number one myth that you would like to break about anorexia?
That anorectics are controlling.
And can you expound on that? Do you mean controlling of themselves, their environment, others?
All of the above. Yeah. So it's definitely the party line, the overarching narrative. A stranger will argue with you on this, like on the street kind of narrative. And I have found not only that it hasn't solved anything, but from my own personal experience, it isn't true. So the experience of anorexia is not a matter of, as it's assumed now, hey, I'm coming into adolescence, which is the common age of its development, but not the only age. A lot of things are out of my control. Here is one thing I can control. I'm going to control it to death. That's the story. It actually doesn't even make sense, because a restrictive anorectic restricts everything. The restriction of food has immediate, visible, and medical consequence, so it's focused on. But she's restricting everything she possibly can that brings her any joy. So I find that my experience of anorexia was one of feeling very controlled. I had internalized controlling voices and experiences in my own life, and I go further into that in the book. My father, the religion in which I was brought up, a number of these formative experiences that told me a lot about my value or lack thereof, and why it was important that I, tended toward and often tried to achieve perfection, which had a lot to do with kind of shining that accomplishment onto others. So in that way, externally and from an internal, integrated, from what I've been raised with, perspective, I felt controlled in every direction. Where I became really convinced that the narrative is incorrect is when I started being a normal adolescent and pushing back ever so slightly in ways that when you read the book will seem almost silly to you. They were met with these huge walls of a reminder of the space in which I was allowed to live. So if I didn't believe it before, when I tried to just begin to grow in a very normal way, I was met with these boulders that I didn't know how to climb.
Marilyn writes, I had a question. You speak a little bit to, you were just mentioning something about your relationship with religion and confines in your growing up, and she was asking, what is your relationship now to religion, and how do you expect it from that experience?
Yeah. And if the next person could ask about politics, we'd be set. That'd be great. And everyone will feel good about it. No, it's such a fair question, and I address it directly in the book, of course. So I'm very comfortable talking about it. I grew up in the United Pentecostal Church in Mississippi, which was pretty stringent, especially on women, in terms of what we could and couldn't do. And I say in the book that, I internalized no so much that I didn't really know how to tell myself yes, because everything in my life felt like a no. So it was a stringent religion. I'm sure it works really well for some. My experience with religion is that it is not inherently bad, but you throw it in a man's hands and it becomes a vehicle for misogyny. And I think the history of that is so deep and consistent that young women tend not to fare well in religion. I could stand here all day and go through this sordid history. It looks quite different by gender, of course, your experience with religion. So I feel strongly that it affected my own ability to feel like I was a valid human who could kind of decide what I wanted to become. And I address it in the book too, that I think, I'll never know obviously because I don't live in their heads, but I think young men had a really different experience than I did. So I'm not a huge fan. I'll leave it at that. Any other questions? Yeah.
I was just gonna say, or ask, what is your opinion on like the current protocol for treatment for anorexia? I guess I don't really know, but could you expand on that?
Yeah.
What's your opinion on it?
I think there are a lot of amazing people trying really hard. So I really want to be conscientious of thanking those who are devoted to doing right by these women who are not only very ill, but just simply very difficult to work with. So I think a lot of caring and really well-meaning work is being done. The challenge, as I see it, is that very little has improved. And I think that's what has to be addressed. So whatever we're doing, it generally is not working. And it's not working in a population that's very dear to me, but I would argue, society tends to, the last 10 years has certainly proved how we feel about young women. So I think that it, if, I don't know, you never know if something's true like this, but I would imagine if it affected a different population, we would have had a very different approach to it. People are always stunned when I say it's the deadliest mental health disorder. Or they push back and say, no, it's substance use, which is actually not true, right? That's a behavior. And Dr. Insel also agrees with that. But I don't know if that answers the question. I can go a little bit more deeply. Yeah, in terms of the treatment paradigm right now, I think folks just really don't know what to do. I certainly wouldn't have, and I certainly don't have the answer. I do not believe that you can take this book and create a therapy center and have 100% success here. Like, I'm not delusional. I just think that the approach we're taking now is almost obviously incorrect. And I'm bringing a story forward saying, hey, this was my very specific experience, having been extremely ill, thriving in my life now, and telling that journey as honestly as I know how, and recognizing how the current treatment paradigm was actually quite harmful during my journey. One of the examples I'll give is group therapy. Anorectics are among the most competitive people on the planet. I have more discipline than anyone. You put us in a group therapy session, and while there may be benefits, I would argue that I would stay very far away from group therapy with anorectics. We learn from one another, and we compete with one another, and we feel badly about how poorly we've done on our own journey toward death, and why aren't we closer to death? That's one example that I think is a little bit absurd. Yeah. Family-based therapy has been shown to help, and there are definitely some entities that are doing that really well. But that essentially is a very deliberate process of individuating the human, which is exactly, I didn't know that until after I read the book actually, but that is exactly the single process that does work, is getting to the point where a girl has her agency, and that's supported throughout the family. Yeah.
Could you speak to an anorectic not being in the throes of the pathology, starving, but living with what that means, like what it is? Is it, once it's over, then what happens?
What's it like once you're refed, and then you're sure you're fine, and then you realize, I'm not even close to fine? It's very discouraging. I think that anorexia is under the banner of eating disorder, which I don't necessarily disagree with. I just think that focusing on the eating misses a lot of the point. The medical issue obviously has to do with metabolic issues that are created by starvation. But the psychological issue, I always say I went through 2 major bouts of anorexia. In the first, I lost a lot more weight, and I was probably a lot more at physical risk. But the second was far more excruciating. It was a lot more psychological. And I think that's what you learn, is that once you're refed, so to speak, and you come to a place where no one would look at you and say, oh yeah, she's sick, or he's sick, then the real journey begins. My experience with that was avoidance, initially, assuming that I was good, and that was hard, and now I'd like to move on. And then things kept creeping in that I realized were unique to me among my friend set, in terms of how I handled things or how I approached relationships, my tolerance for risk, for example, and just kind of the different ways that I ordered my world for safety. But I remember feeling, before I started this book, I remember having this flash feeling that used to be really familiar to me when I was very ill, that I just wanted to die. Right? One of the reasons anorexia has such a high mortality rate is certainly, immediate cardiac death due to the imbalance of electrolytes that you cultivate through starvation, but also suicide. And I was never to the point where I was proactive with that, but if that had happened, that would have been fine. And it scared me to have that thought all those years after I was weight stealing. And I think that's when it really struck me that there's something entirely else going on beyond just food restriction. So I started to dive in, and it was very painful and really hard. And I still work with it quite a bit, actually. Yeah. One of the things that I think a common question that I'll hear sometimes is like, how is the world different for you now? Someone would look at you and not necessarily know. What is one thing that you think is really specific to your anorexic brain, I call it, which is, whatever structurally is different. And there's certainly something which has been demonstrated. But I have sort of an aberrant approach to relationship tolerance, I guess I would say. I am really delighted by people who can just kind of roll with challenges in their relationship, and you can tell one of my degrees is in conflict management and peace studies, and actually the weekend before I came here, I taught a class on managing workplace relationships, and I'm right now in the middle of teaching a class on culture and conflict, so hopefully I know something about conflict, but I also recognize that I don't have a very high tolerance for feeling pretty negative in any particular relationship. And I'm very comfortable then gracefully, no harm, no foul, walking completely away from that relationship and literally never returning to it. That is one way I think, and I'm sure there are others who are not anorexic who have that same mentality, but for me, it is an immediate, hard no, and it's over. I think it's a defense mechanism. I think it's a protection because the monster is fed by criticism. So if I end up feeling pretty negative after interactions with someone on an ongoing basis, I'm just not going to subject myself to that trigger, I guess you could call it that. So there are other ways in which I can see it's, some of my behaviors might be a little aberrant, but that's one that whether or not it's good, I'm not going to change it. I don't know that I could.
Here comes comes the political question.
Oh, good. I was waiting for it. We hit religion.
You asked for politics.
Yeah.
So, realizing that every case is probably as individual as the person that it affects, what advice from your experience, what generic advice would you give to three groups of people? First, the anorectic who's battling. Second, the, call it friends, family, community. And then thirdly, I'll say the generic medical community that does not have either any exposure or enough exposure to anorexia. What advice would you give each one of those groups?
What a great question. So let me frame this up with, I am not a doctor, and this is not medical advice. I think this is advice born of personal experience at a pretty extreme level. For the anorectic, yeah, I can't even, I will cry. What I would say to an anorectic is you're just so much more than you know. You're just so much more than you know. And when you can integrate that and own it, you have a chance. But man, that takes a long time. And I don't assume that every anorectic has the influences I had in my life. I had a narcissistic sociopath as a parent. I had extreme religious influence that was, I think, very negative, especially on young women. But I came to see myself as just worthless, useless, except in as much as I could make someone else shine. So then that became my worth and my use and my goal. And I think that's common among anorectics. I'm not saying that every anorectic has, a narcissistic father. But I think there are influences in your life, and they could even just be social, for heaven's sake, they're out there and they're strong. That your value is not intrinsic. It is in as much as it benefits others. So what I would tell the anorectic is that you are intrinsically incredible. There's a lot of data showing that there's almost an exceptional quality in terms of academic, IQ, EQ, kind of off the charts typically. The anorectic tends to be fairly phenomenal, and I hesitate to say that because I'm throwing myself in the bucket, and that's not what I'm trying to do, but the recognition that you are intrinsically worthy and enough, and that you don't exist for anyone else, and that your pursuit of joy doesn't harm anyone else. That's what I would tell her. What I would tell the friends and family is, my gosh, it is hard. One thing I try to be really honest about in the book is it's not a dance through the tulips, this book. It's hopeful and it's positive in the end, but I'm very honest about how incredibly difficult I was. And that's obviously, I can't do anything about that now, but that's where I was. But it's more of a recognition of what that put others through and how difficult that must be. I have a ton of grace for friends and family in support of an anorectic or someone with an eating disorder, because it feels like the solution is just right there. Don't ever say, ever, ever, ever to anyone, just eat. It's so much deeper. So what she's going through is this absolute, brutal, sometimes violent voice in her head that reduces her to nothing all the time. Don't feed that voice. Do not become an additional critic. Don't blame her for anything. It's frankly not her fault. The more that friends and family can see her or him and the illness as separate entities, the faster this can grow and this can shrink. If you conflate them, if you tell her she's that, she knows how awful that thing is. You're telling her she's awful. In the book, I speak to, sometimes to get to her, you have to go through him. And it's not a very fun journey. And you're probably going to hear a lot of really nasty stuff. But if you recognize that's what she's hearing all the time, and are willing to get to the other side of it, to find her, and then not blame her once you find her, I think that's really crucial. bringing joy, happiness, levity, fun, lightheartedness into her life, as small as that seems, I credit that with literally the grounding on which I got well. So remembering that she may not want to touch food, that's fine. There are plenty of other places where joy can be found, and that will lighten the sense of restriction, and if you lighten it anywhere, you lighten it everywhere. Food is going to be the hardest place to start. Start somewhere else. Find something else she's really passionate about. She may not feel like she has any of that anymore, passion, but whatever it was, or whatever it seems like it might be, who cares what it is? Even better if it doesn't make anyone else look good, right? Then it's meaningful to her. So cultivating the hell out of that, I would say. In terms of the medical community, I think we just really have to revisit what we think, recognizing that we've made precious little progress in an area where progress is really needed. So my call is have the humility, and I've seen so many people who do, and it's beautiful to say, gosh, maybe we don't know. And then listen to as many voices as have had the experience, patch that together into something to consider, and don't give up. Just because it's not a money-making proposition, don't give up.
Jesse Ransom has a question.
Jesse James Ransom.
He says, long question. You spoke of what you did when you got to re-fed and you realized that it didn't fix everything and you realized that you weren't fine. What were the things you personally had to do to deal with the discouragement that comes with the plateau where the goals become more nebulous? I ask because a lot of people dealing with many conditions have trouble maintaining a level of consistency in recovery when faced with the idea that you're still not fine. Insecurities, trauma, etc. that don't go away, continuing to try to steal joy.
Oh, Jesse. I love you, Jesse. Jesse is an alum of this place. He'll absolutely murder me later for saying that out loud. Of the law school, actually. And easily one of the smartest people I know. So thank you for dialing in, Jess. Yeah, my discipline came in handy on the other side of the illness. So I joke, but it's also true that it takes remarkable discipline to execute on anorexia. Right? If anyone, I know this is such a weird way to say it, but just to drive that point home, if any one of you, when you were leaving here today, if I said, here's the challenge, drop as close to like half of your standard body weight as you can, go, right? It's not likely. It's just not likely. The discipline to stay with that is intense. It's incredible. So I don't think it's unique to anorexia, but I do think it is a superpower of anorexia, and it is badly implemented on behalf of starvation. But it can be wisely implemented on behalf of many, many, many other things. So what kept me going, and I tell the story in my book, was there was a point at which I just called myself on what I was doing and said, at least have the self-respect to decide to die. One or the other. Don't let it just happen. You're better than that. And I chose to live, and it felt like I couldn't have cared less which way that decision went at that time. Truly. Couldn't have cared less. But had enough support and people who loved me that gave me enough desire to show them that I cared about them, which was hard to do when I was ill. That it gave me enough strength to decide to live. And then I just continued in the path of living, and that sounds a lot easier than it was. It was excruciating, literally physically painful and otherwise, because eating after you've not been eating is one of the most painful things you could do. So I chose to live, and I kept choosing to live, and I feel like I still do that to this day. And it sounds really simple, and I don't mean for it to, because it is a difficult choice sometimes, because it requires things of you that are not necessarily what you want to do in the moment. But I guess the truth is, I don't know the answer to that question. I think each person has to find their will to live. I go into Will to Power and Will to Live, and Apollo and Dionysus, and these like ancient marriages and dichotomies, and how you work through that psychologically to find something worth pursuing. And I think if there's something in life worth pursuing, that was everything for me. I don't claim to know what that looks like for someone else, but that was everything for me. People you love really help. Thank you, Jess. Any other questions? I'd like to thank Dylan and Jeff for showing up and taking photos. Incredibly generous, both of you. Thank you. Hugely generous. Thank you for making me cry, Tom. And thank you for almost making me cry, Jess. This is my baby. She enters the world today. She's gone to college. She went to a pretty good one. I'm proud of her. I wrote this in a way that however I feel about this when I'm 80, I will at least know that I told the truest truth I knew how to tell at the time. That was my criteria. And as much as anyone else shows up in here, with the rarest exception, there's one, they've read the book, they've said, yeah, this is fine. So you can take comfort in that when you read it. They're all still alive. So that's a heck of a thing to write a book with all those other people in it that can talk to you about it over the dinner table. So honesty was a serious criteria. So that was my goal, and that was really the intention in terms of just best understanding myself, to know that I would never do that to myself again. And if it helps you in any way, then that is incredible gravy. Thank you all. If you'd like a book, I don't really know how the book purchasing part works, I'll be honest. But I know how to sign a book. So I probably would sign it here and you take it downstairs. But that would be my absolute pleasure. And then a few of us are going out to dinner. I feel like I can invite everyone along. Yeah, so if you want to join us, it's hard to do that to you, Tom. We'd love it. Thank you, Ashley, again, and the Harvard COOP. You're all just absolutely magical. Thank you for making it so special.